The magician walked around the winding mountain road under the shadow of the volcano, towards the mountain village. He knew that by now a few of the shepherd boys up on the slopes would have run ahead to let everybody know a stranger was on the way. And so he wasn't surprised when he found his way blocked by 3 men standing across the road. "What are you then? Priest? Thief? Not a warrior, surely?" "No, magician, actually." "Then where's your wand? Your spell book?" "Give me your hand." And the magician took the man's hand and drew there a beautiful butterfly. "Yes, very pretty, but it's not exactly magic, is it?" And the magician leaned forwards and blew across the man's palm, and the butterfly rose up from the skin, fluttered around them once or twice, before disappearing off into the trees. The magician felt arms clap around him. He was lifted up through the air and carried through the village, through to the tavern, where he was sat down on the best table there, and food and wine were brought for him, while word spread around the real magician had arrived. The children were the first ones, of course. They all came along, holding out their hands expectantly, asking the magician could he maybe draw them a deer, or a bear, or a seal? And pretty soon the tabletop resembled a small wilderness with all the animals chasing each other around. But after the children had been put to bed, it was the turn of the adults. And usually, of course, they asked for something useful, holding out their hands and asking for a new knife or a water skin. But eventually it always happened that somebody had the idea of, could they maybe have a piece of silver? Or even gold? "The more you ask for, the worse it will be," the magician told them. But he drew what they asked for. And pretty soon, a party was in progress. As the musicians went home to bring their instruments out, and the landlord broke out his best bottles of spirits. And all in all, the magician had a hard time getting an early night. But it was essential, he told them, to replenish his magical powers to give them more gifts the next day. And so he'd be given the best room in the house, and he closed the door upon the last of the well-wishers, bringing bowls of soup and offers to marry their daughters. And the magician would lie back upon his bed of furs, full of food and wine, feeling quite miserable and alone. Alone with a secret that meant he'd be rising up early the next morning, before the sun rose, to sneak out of the village like a thief in the night. And it would only be once he'd gone around the first bend on the hill that he'd feel his guilt start to lift. His guilt at the thought of the anger and sadness of the villagers, when they would wake up in the morning to find that their magical gifts had vanished, disappeared with the arrival of morning, just like the stars. And it would only be when he'd make his breakfast under a tree that he'd really start to feel better about things. I mean, what did they expect? Since when was happiness ever found in things? In a way, he'd done them a valuable lesson. Well, it was a living anyway. But on this particular morning, the magician saw that someone had followed him out of the village. And as the figure wound around the mountain road towards him, he guessed it must be someone come to complain about a a missing pearl necklace or a diamond ring. And only when she drew close to him and pulled back her hood, he saw it was a beautiful young woman, her hair golden like the morning sunshine trailing down upon her shoulders and her eyes as blue as the mountain lakes. And she laid down at his feet a package of bread and cheese. Some people never learn. What can I do for you then? Perhaps you'd like a gold necklace. How about a nice shining ruby?
No, I want you to make me a baby, the girl told him.
A baby? I can't draw a baby on the palm of your hand.
So draw it here,
the girl said, pulling up her shirt. The magician hesitated, but finally said, "The more you ask for, the worse it will be." But he made her lie down in the grass, and she pulled up her shirt, and he took out his feather and bottle of ink and began to work. And as he drew a life-size baby there, on her belly, on her smooth, virgin skin, he could feel her tremble with hesitation and anticipation. And when he finally blew the baby into existence, the cry of the mother mingled with the scream of the newborn babe, and the magician had never seen such happiness in anyone's face, quite distinct from the greedy expressions of the villagers when they got their gifts. So when she asked him if she might travel on with him, he couldn't accept, for he'd quite fallen in love with this young woman who'd come along with the morning breeze, and he just couldn't bear to break her heart the next day when she found that her baby had disappeared. The magician quite lost his taste for drawing magical gifts after that, and he withdrew to a cave by the sea, where he sat for the next 5 years. Sometimes he'd draw little boats, which he'd then throw out into the waves, quite indifferent as to whether they were carried out to sea or smashed upon the rocks. And there wasn't a day that went past that he didn't think of her. He heard her laugh in the way the water splashed upon the shore. He saw the colours of her eyes in the sunset sky. And one day, when 5 years had passed, without quite knowing why, he found himself standing up and walking back up the mountain path towards the village where he'd first met her. He didn't know how he would begin to explain it to her, he who had always had all of the answers. He had to make her see that magic was a thing of the moment. It was free of yesterdays and tomorrows. He expected grief. He expected anger. What he didn't expect was for a 5-year-old boy to come running out of the field, wrap his arms around him and cry, "Daddy!" His mother followed with a basket of corn at her waist. "Is this your son?"
"Our son?"
And the magician pulled back the hair to reveal the boy's nose. Exactly the kind of nose he'd always most liked to draw. "But how can it be? Everything I draw disappears the next day."
"Maybe because you forget? Did you ever forget us?" "It was hard for us when I came back. A young, unmarried woman with a baby. My family threw us out of the house. But now you're home. We can be a family again." With tears in his eyes, the magician grabbed a stick and ran into the field and drew out in the mud a house for them all to live in. And so they all lived happily ever after. Or at least they would have done if the story ended there. See, the thing about happy endings, if you like them, is to know when to end the story. All stories end in death, eventually. The human race will one day be no more. Eventually, the sun itself will burn out. There will come a time when the last star is born and burns up, and so the universe will be nothing but a cold, black wasteland. It was a few years later. The magician awoke one morning to the sound of an enormous explosion. The volcano up on the hill, long thought to be dormant, had erupted. And already screams of panic were coming from the villages and houses further up the slope. The magician jumped out of bed, ran around to the side of the house, and took a broom and dunked it in a barrel of water. And he drew a horse and cart on the road. Moments later, he and his wife and his son were riding down the mountain road for their lives, a tide of death behind them as the volcanic lava poured downwards. They rode all the way down to the beach, and there were gathered hundreds of people, all eyes staring back at the volcano. The magician drew a boat out in the sand, big enough for himself and his family. He pushed it into the water, got his wife and son on board, and he started to push it out deeper, and he was about to climb on himself when there came an angry cry from the crowd behind them who had just seen the boat. And a thick arm came around his neck and pulled him backwards. And the crowd began to surge forwards into the water towards the boat. Well, from the ground where he lay, the magician sketched out in the sand a swarm of angry wasps. And moments later, the crowd fell to the ground, attacked by the stinging insects. A wind picked up. The sails of the boat were filled, and the boat began to blow out to sea. And from where the magician lay, helpless under a pile of bodies, all he could do was scratch out in the leather belt of the man lying on top of him a butterfly. The butterfly floated up above the pile of bodies, through the air, and onto the cheek of his beloved. All of this happened over 2,000 years ago. The magician told me. I was in my hometown in the south of England, and I was walking down to the town centre, and you have to pass this big flat park. It isn't much of a place, not even many trees, but you have to go through it anyway. And a couple of times a year, a travelling fair comes there. I've never liked fairs. The noisy, scary rides and the horrible food they serve. But as I was walking through, I saw this tent saying, "Temporary tattoos." And I've always wondered what it might be like to have a tattoo. Maybe something on the arm or the leg, but I could never decide just what I would want there. But a temporary one, well, that I could live with. And I went in, and there was this old man behind the table who looked strangely familiar somehow. And I told him to draw me a dragonfly I've always liked the way they can fly through the air. They're amazing. And he drew on my skin this dragonfly, and it was so beautiful, so vibrant. It looked almost as if it could just jump off the skin and into the air, which is exactly what happened a few moments later when he leant across and blew upon it. And then he told me the story that you've just heard. The magician had crawled out from the pile of bodies once they saw that the volcano had stopped erupting and it looked like everyone would live after all, though they would have to rebuild their villages. He drew himself another boat in the sand and headed out to sea, looking for his wife and his son. But the currents and the winds, it seemed, had taken them different directions. And when he finally hit land, he spent the next few years, the next few decades, looking for them. Looking for as long as hope allowed him to. Until enough time had passed, it didn't seem reasonable to believe that either one of them would be alive anymore. The magician fell into a deep depression. Wandering, he didn't know where, just allowing the wind to push him which way it might. Until one day, the magician found himself walking past a market town. And there, at the crossroads, there passed a young man who had exactly the same kind of eyes he'd once drawn on a young girl's belly, lying in the grass. And he realized he was looking at a descendant of that original drawing. I said, yes, it's a very nice story, but why are you telling me exactly? Because you got exactly the same kind of nose I've always most liked to draw. And I realized I was looking at my great, many times great grandfather. It was only later that I did the maths. If this all really happened over 2,000 years ago, then that means that 1 in 7 of us alive today is descended from that original drawing. And if what the magician drew only carries on existing because he remembers, what would happen if he forgets? And a magician lives a long time, it seems, but perhaps not forever. And that's why, every night before I go to sleep, I say a prayer for the health and memory of the magician. Otherwise, the sun might come up one day to find that 1 in 7 of us is no longer here.